Officer, that's him. The one causing the disturbance.
I'll be damned.
Senior Chief Thorne?
Sergeant. Good to see you.
The pressurized hum of the cabin was a familiar, almost comforting sound. Sovereign Air Flight 822 was an hour out of LaGuardia, climbing through a sea of brilliant white clouds on its mid-morning journey to Atlanta. In Seat 2B, Marcus Thorne shifted slightly, the fine leather of the first-class seat creaking softly beneath him. He had been reading a dense history of the Peloponnesian War, but the recycled air was dry, and a familiar thirst was setting in. He glanced around. The morning beverage service had concluded some 20 minutes prior, but the flight attendants were still moving quietly about the galley. He pressed the call button above his head. The small blue light illuminated, and a soft chime echoed in the cabin's quiet. He waited. 1 minute passed, then 3, then 5. He watched as a flight attendant with sharp blonde hair tied back in a severe bun emerged from the galley, attended to a call 3 rows behind him, and then returned to the galley without so much as a glance in his direction. His call light remained lit. Marcus was not an impatient man. His life, both past and present, had been an exhaustive exercise in discipline and control. He simply registered the delay as a data point, an anomaly in the otherwise meticulous world of first-class air travel. After 10 minutes had passed, he pressed the button again. Another chime. This time, the blonde flight attendant appeared at his row almost immediately. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, with a name tag that read Chloe. Her smile was a thin, practiced line that didn't reach her cool, blue eyes. She stood with her weight on one hip, a posture that conveyed not service, but challenge. "Your light is on," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice a low, even baritone. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water, please?" Chloe's eyes flickered from his face down to the book in his lap and back up again. It was a micro-expression, a flash of something that looked like assessment, or perhaps reassessment. "The beverage service has concluded. We'll be starting the meal service in about 45 minutes. Marcus maintained eye contact, his own expression unreadable. "I understand. I'd just like a glass of water now if it's not too much trouble." He had been polite. He had been direct. It was, in the grand calculus of human interaction, among the simplest and most reasonable requests one could make. But the flight attendant's posture stiffened. She tilted her head, the practiced smile vanishing completely. "We're very busy preparing for the meal service. It's a multi-course service. We can't just stop everything to run individual drink orders." The explanation was both nonsensical and deliberately obstructive. Marcus had flown this route dozens of times. He knew for a fact that a pitcher of ice water was a permanent fixture in the first-class galley. Fulfilling his request would take no more than 30 seconds. He could see a junior flight attendant behind her, polishing wine glasses, a task of no particular urgency. "I'm sure you're busy," Marcus said, his tone still perfectly level. "A simple glass of water is all I'm asking for." "And I've told you," she said, her voice now carrying a sharp, condescending edge that sliced through the cabin's quiet hum, "that you will have to wait for the meal service." Across the aisle, a man in a gray business suit who had been pretending to read his newspaper lowered it by an inch, his eyes peering over the top. The interaction was becoming noticeable. It was exactly what Marcus sought to avoid. He was a man who moved through the world with a quiet economy of motion and language, drawing as little attention as possible. It was a discipline learned in places far more consequential than a first-class cabin. He held Chloe's gaze for a long moment. He could have argued. He could have pointed out the absurdity of her refusal. He could have escalated. But his training, his entire life philosophy, was about de-escalation. It was about choosing the ground on which you fight, and this was not it. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well. I'll wait." He lifted his book and fixed his eyes on the page, effectively dismissing her. He didn't see the look on her face, but the man in the business suit did. It was a flash of triumphant irritation, the look of a person who had picked a fight, won on a technicality, and was somehow angry that her opponent had simply walked off the field. She turned without another word and stalked back to the galley, the sharp click of her heels on the cabin floor sounding like punctuation marks to a sentence no one else had understood. In the galley, she leaned over to her junior partner, a young man named Liam, and spoke in a low, furious whisper he couldn't quite hear, but the sentiment was clear. The man in seat 2B had challenged her authority, and Chloe Jensen did not tolerate being challenged. Marcus Thorne was 41 years old, and he was a master of inhabiting spaces without disturbing them. His stillness was not passive, it was a conscious state of being, a product of thousands of hours spent in observation, waiting for the one critical detail that could change everything. Sitting in seat 2B, he appeared to be just another successful professional. He wore a dark gray quarter-zip sweater over a crisp white-collared shirt, tailored charcoal slacks, and polished black leather loafers. His watch was a simple, functional luminox, its military heritage invisible to the untrained eye. There was nothing about him that overtly broadcasted his history. That was intentional. To the world, he was the founder and CEO of Praetorian Solutions, a high-end security consultancy that advised Fortune 100 companies on risk mitigation, executive protection, and logistical security in unstable regions. His clients knew him as a man of unnerving calm, a strategist who saw angles others missed, and a professional whose word was his bond. They paid him enormous sums of money because he could walk into a chaotic environment, a corporate headquarters during a hostile takeover, a mining operation in a politically volatile country, and impose order through sheer competence and foresight. He was, in every sense of the word, an expert in threat assessment. But that was only the second act of his life. The first had been carved out in the salt spray, the desert grit, and the classified shadows of the world's most dangerous places. For 16 years, Marcus Thorne had been a United States Navy SEAL. He had risen to the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer, a leadership position earned through a decade and a half of sustained excellence in the most demanding special operations environment on the planet. He had served with SEAL Team 4, deploying to Latin America, and later with the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the elite unit more commonly known as SEAL Team 6. His service record was a quiet testament to a life lived at the sharp end of the spear. A Silver Star for gallantry in action, 2 Bronze Stars with V for valor, a Purple Heart from a mission whose details remained sealed in a classified after-action report. He had led teams, trained foreign commandos, and survived operations where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in millimeters and seconds. He had learned to read human behavior not from textbooks, but from life-or-death interrogations and high-stakes negotiations. He knew the subtle tells of a liar, the physiological signs of aggression, the vacant stare of a man about to do something violent. He understood that the greatest threat often came not from the loudest voice in the room, but from the one who wielded their authority with quiet, simmering resentment. He was flying to Atlanta to oversee the final preparations for a major international banking conference his firm was securing. It was routine work, a world of spreadsheets, motorcade logistics, and magnetometer placements. It was a world he had chosen, a deliberate step away from the kinetic violence of his past. Yet the core principles remained the same: observe, assess, control the environment. Never let emotion dictate your response. When the flight attendant Chloe had refused his request for water, he had performed a threat assessment in less than a second. Her verbal response was a 9 on a scale of 1 to 10 for hostility, but her physical posture registered as a 2 for actual threat. She was not a physical danger. The danger she posed was of a different sort. It was the danger of ego, of a petty tyrant guarding a minuscule kingdom of beverage carts and cabin announcements. He had seen this archetype before, in corrupt local officials at foreign checkpoints, in insecure bureaucrats who clung to the power of their rubber stamp. They created problems not for strategic gain, but for the simple, narcotic satisfaction of watching someone else bend to their will. The most effective way to deal with such individuals was to deny them that satisfaction, to offer no reaction, no anger, no frustration for them to feed on. His calm refusal to engage further was not an act of submission. It was a strategic disengagement, a denial of her objective. He had won the exchange by refusing to fight. He turned a page in his book, his mind absorbing the ancient strategies of Athens and Sparta. But a part of his awareness remained fixed on the galley. He could hear her voice, low and sharp, talking to her partner. He didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. He was now a target, not a physical one, but a social one. He had failed to show the proper deference, and in her small kingdom, that was a crime that required punishment. He took a slow, deep breath, the kind he had practiced in the belly of a C-17 transport plane before a nighttime jump, and continued to read. The situation was contained, for now. Chloe Jensen was 36 years old and had been flying with Sovereign Air for 12 years. In her mind, she wasn't just a flight attendant, she was the curator of the first-class experience. She viewed the front cabin of every aircraft she worked not as a public space, but as her own private domain, a carefully controlled environment where her standards were law. She bid exclusively for the high-prestige domestic routes, New York to LA, San Francisco to DC, and this one, LaGuardia to Atlanta, a favorite of corporate executives and minor celebrities. She had seniority, and she used it to ensure she was always the lead flight attendant, the one in charge. Among the junior crew, who were often assigned to work under her, she was known by a nickname, spoken only in whispered tones in crew lounges and airport hotels. The Inspector. The name was born of her obsessive attention to detail, which often crossed the line into outright condescension. She didn't just instruct, she corrected. She would watch a junior attendant like Liam pour a glass of champagne and then step in to wipe a non-existent drip from the bottle. She would rearrange the napkins he had just set out, telling him his folds were too soft. Today was no different. Before the incident with the man in 2B, she had already reprimanded Liam twice. Once for not having the pre-departure orange juice chilled to her exact preference. "It needs to be crisp, Liam, not just cool." And once for his hesitant tone during the safety briefing announcement. "You have to project authority," she had told him, her voice a low hiss in the galley. "These passengers need to know we are in command of this cabin. It's about safety. It's about perception." But it wasn't really about safety. It was about control. Chloe's entire professional identity was built on the meticulous order of her first-class cabin. The passengers, in her view, were divided into two categories, those who belonged and those who did not. Those who belonged understood the unspoken rules. They were the discreetly wealthy, the quietly powerful, the ones who dressed in understated cashmere and ordered their scotch by name. They recognized her authority and appreciated her rigid, formal service style. They made her feel seen, respected. Then there were the others, the ones on discounted upgrade tickets, the loud tourists, the ones who wore jeans or t-shirts. She saw them as interlopers, temporary occupants who failed to appreciate the sanctity of her space. And the man in seat 2B, Marcus Thorne, had immediately fallen into this second category in her mind. It wasn't just his simple, unbranded clothing, though that was part of it. It was his stillness, his quiet confidence. He hadn't tried to engage her with small talk during boarding. He hadn't made a show of settling into his seat. He had simply occupied it with an air of absolute, unshakable self-possession. It was an authority that rivaled her own, and she found it intolerable. Her refusal to get him a glass of water was a test, a small assertion of her dominance. She expected him to become indignant, to argue, perhaps to raise his voice. That would have confirmed her initial assessment of him as someone who didn't belong, someone who didn't understand the rules. It would have given her the justification she needed to label him as a problem. His calm acceptance of her decision was, in a way, more infuriating than an argument would have been. He had refused to play his assigned role in her drama. "Can you believe the nerve?" she muttered to Liam now, aggressively polishing a coffee pot that was already gleaming. "Pressing the call button twice, like he's the only person on this plane." Liam, a 24-year-old with a perpetually nervous energy, just wanted to get through the flight without another correction. He had seen the man in 2B, He had seen nothing remotely aggressive or demanding in his demeanor. "He just asked for water, Chloe," he ventured timidly. Chloe slammed the coffee pot down on the counter. "It's not about the water, Liam. It's about the attitude. He's challenging. You're new, you don't see it yet. There's a certain type. They get a first-class ticket and they think they own the plane. They think we're their personal servants. You have to establish boundaries from the very beginning, or they will walk all over you for the entire flight." She was framing her behavior as a professional lesson, a piece of wisdom from a seasoned veteran to a naive rookie. But Liam wasn't buying it. He had seen Chloe be warm and effusive with the elderly couple in 1A and 1C. He had watched her laugh and joke with the man in the suit across the aisle from Thorne. The boundary she was establishing was a line drawn around a single passenger. He didn't understand why, but he knew better than to argue. He picked up a cloth and began polishing already clean glasses, his silence a shield against her escalating agitation. He just wanted to land in Atlanta. Chloe, however, was just getting started. She felt a wrong had been committed against her, and she was already planning how she would rectify it. The next phase of the flight unfolded with a quiet, calculated precision. It was a masterclass in passive aggression, so subtle that most passengers would never notice it. But to the target, and to a careful observer, it was as clear as a fingerprint on glass. Chloe Jensen began to systematically erase Marcus Thorne from the first-class cabin. The coffee service began 40 minutes after the water incident. Liam pushed the cart and Chloe followed, pouring. She moved down the right side of the aisle first. "Mister Chanel, more coffee?" she asked the man in the suit in seat 2C, her voice warm and solicitous. "I'm good for now, thank you," David Chanel replied, his eyes once again flicking over his newspaper toward Marcus. Chloe then served the row behind him before crossing to the left side of the aisle. She poured a refill for the woman in 1B, then moved down the aisle. As she reached row 2, she turned her body slightly, angling herself away from Marcus. She looked directly at the passenger in seat 3B, a young woman engrossed in her laptop. "Coffee, miss?" The woman shook her head without looking up. Chloe then pushed the cart past Marcus's seat, her movements smooth and deliberate, as if seat 2B were an empty space, a glitch in the cabin's matrix. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply passed him by. Marcus, who had been watching her approach in his peripheral vision, registered the slight without a change in expression. He hadn't wanted coffee, but that was irrelevant. The act was the message. It was a continuation of her earlier assertion of dominance, another attempt to provoke a reaction. He refused to give her one. He turned a page in his book. But David Chanot, the businessman in 2C, saw the entire performance. He was a corporate lawyer in his 50s, a man whose career depended on observing nuances in behavior. He had seen Chloe's face after the initial water request. He had just witnessed the coffee maneuver. This was no longer a simple case of bad service. It was targeted. It was personal. And it was making him deeply uncomfortable. He lowered his newspaper completely and began to watch openly. Next came the hot towels. Liam came down the aisle with a tray and a pair of silver tongs, offering a steaming, lemon-scented towel to each passenger. He gave one to Chanot. He approached seat 2B and hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting toward the galley where Chloe was watching him. He made eye contact with Marcus. Marcus gave a barely perceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement. Liam, looking relieved, offered him a towel. Marcus took it, murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and saw Chloe's sharp, disapproving glare directed at her junior partner from the front of the cabin. She had clearly instructed him to skip the man in 2B, and he had disobeyed. When Liam returned to the galley, her back was to the cabin, but Chanot could see the rigid set of her shoulders and the sharp, angry gestures she made as she spoke to the young man in a furious whisper. The final act before the meal was the distribution of menus. Chloe handled this herself. She moved through the cabin with a stack of large cardstock menus, handing one to each passenger with a flourish. "Our lunch options for today," she would announce with a smile. She handed one to Chanot. She handed them to the rows behind. She then crossed the aisle and, just as with the coffee, walked directly past seat 2B without a word, handing a menu to the passenger in row 1. This time, the slight was impossible to ignore. A menu was not an optional amenity. It was a necessary component of the service. Marcus waited a moment, then calmly raised his hand, not to press the call button, but to get her attention as she passed again. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I believe you missed me." Chloe stopped and turned to face him. Her expression was one of pure theatrical surprise, as if she were only just now noticing his existence. "Oh," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I'm so sorry. I must not have seen you." It was a lie so blatant, so insulting, that it hung in the air between them. "We have the pan-seared salmon or the grilled chicken salad." She recited the options from memory without offering him the physical menu. "I'll have the chicken salad," Marcus said, his voice betraying no hint of anger. "And a glass of water." A flicker of triumph flashed in Chloe's eyes. She had finally forced him to ask for something again. "Of course," she said, the smile returning to her face, thin and sharp as a razor. "Coming right up." She turned and walked back to the galley. David Chanot just shook his head slowly, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He had seen enough. This wasn't just poor service, it was a campaign of harassment. He didn't know who the man in 2B was, but he knew he was witnessing something deeply unprofessional and ugly. He pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, and on the corner of his newspaper he began to make notes. Times, specific actions, the flight attendant's name. As a lawyer, he knew the value of a contemporaneous record. He had a feeling it might be needed. After the meal service, a relative peace settled over the cabin. Trays were cleared, window shades were lowered, and most passengers settled in to watch movies, work, or sleep. Marcus finished his salad, which had been delivered curtly and without the usual offer of bread or a drink refill. He had spent the last hour working on his laptop, finalizing the security schematics for the Atlanta conference. The work was intricate, requiring intense focus, and he found it helped to occasionally stand and stretch to keep his mind sharp. He closed his laptop, stowed it carefully in the seat pocket in front of him, and decided he needed a small, leather-bound notebook he had packed in his carry-on. The bag, a simple black ballistic nylon duffel, was in the overhead compartment directly above his seat. The gesture was as common and unremarkable as any on an airplane. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up in the aisle, and turned to face the overhead bin. He was a tall man, 6'2", with the broad shoulders and lean physique of a lifetime athlete. Even in the confined space of the aircraft, his movements were efficient and controlled. He reached up, pressed the latch, and the bin door swung down smoothly. His notebook was right on top, next to a folded jacket. He reached in, retrieved it, and was about to close the bin. From the front galley, Chloe Jensen was watching his every move. She had been observing him intermittently for the entire flight, her gaze a constant, hostile pressure. In her mind, a narrative had been building, a story where every action he took was a piece of evidence confirming her initial prejudice. His calm was suspicious. His politeness was a mask. His request for water was a challenge. His quiet work on his laptop was him casing the cabin. She was not observing reality. She was manufacturing a threat to fit her worldview. When Marcus stood up, her entire body tensed. She saw not a passenger retrieving an item, but a large, imposing man making a sudden move. She saw his height not as a physical attribute, but as an assertion of dominance. When he reached into the overhead bin, her mind, already primed for suspicion, leaped to the most extreme conclusion. She grabbed Liam's arm, her fingers digging into his bicep. Her voice was a low, urgent hiss. "Did you see that? Look at him!" Liam looked up from where he was collecting trash. He saw a passenger, the one from 2B, standing at his seat, retrieving something from the overhead. The man had his back to them. He was doing nothing remotely threatening. "What about him?" Liam asked, confused. "He's just getting something from his bag." "No," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide. "He's been acting agitated this whole flight. He keeps looking around. Now he's up, moving aggressively. He's making me nervous. Something is wrong with him." The words were a complete fabrication, a projection of her own internal state onto him. Marcus hadn't been agitated. He had been preternaturally calm. He hadn't been looking around. He had been reading and working. And his movement had not been aggressive. It had been perfectly normal. But Chloe was no longer tethered to facts. Marcus found his notebook, tucked it under his arm, and placed his hand on the bin door to close it. As he did, he paused for a moment and stretched his back, rolling his shoulders to release the stiffness from sitting. It was a motion that lasted no more than 3 seconds. To Chloe, this was the final damning piece of evidence. "He's stalling," she breathed, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and excitement. "He's surveying the cabin. He's planning something. I have a bad feeling about this, Liam. A very bad feeling." Liam stared at her, then back at Marcus, who was now closing the bin and sitting back down in his seat. The entire event, from standing to sitting, had taken less than 30 seconds. The threat Chloe was describing existed only in her head. Liam knew it. He could see with his own eyes that the man was calm, that the situation was normal. He opened his mouth to say so, to challenge the absurd narrative she was weaving out of thin air. He could have said, "Chloe, he just got a notebook. He's sitting down now. Everything is fine." But he didn't. He looked at her face, at the fervent, unshakable conviction in her eyes. He remembered her earlier anger, her seniority, his own probationary status. Confronting her would mean a fight. It would mean a negative report in his file. It would mean making trouble. And so, in a moment of career-preserving cowardice, he said nothing. He simply looked away, his silence a tacit endorsement of her delusion. That silence was all the confirmation Chloe needed. Her suspicions had been validated. The threat was real. And now, she had a duty to act. She turned away from the cabin and reached for the interphone, the direct line to the cockpit. She knew the words to use, the specific, regulated language that would bypass all questions and force the captain to take her seriously. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was the cabin's last line of defense against a danger she herself had invented. The interphone chirped once in the cockpit. Captain Frank Miller, a veteran pilot with 30 years of experience, lifted the receiver. "Go for flight deck." On the other end, Chloe Jensen's voice was a carefully modulated blend of urgency and professionalism. She knew she couldn't sound hysterical. She had to sound like a crew member making a credible threat assessment. This was a performance, and she had been rehearsing for it in her mind for the last hour. "Captain, this is Chloe in the forward cabin," she began, her voice low and steady. "I need to report a security concern regarding the passenger in seat 2B. On the flight deck, Miller and his first officer exchanged a brief, serious glance. Any in-flight security concern was treated with the utmost gravity. "Go ahead, Chloe, what are you seeing?" "Captain, the passenger has been exhibiting erratic and hostile behavior throughout the flight," she said, choosing her words with deliberate precision. Erratic and hostile were trigger words in aviation security protocols. They suggested unpredictability and potential aggression. "He was confrontational with me during beverage service. He has been scanning the cabin and crew, and he just made a sudden, aggressive move toward the overhead compartment." She painted a picture of Marcus's actions that was a grotesque distortion of reality. His calm request for water became confrontational. His quiet reading and work became scanning the cabin. His simple act of retrieving a notebook became a sudden, aggressive move. She was a novelist, crafting a fiction of imminent danger. "Is he armed? Have you seen any kind of weapon?" Miller asked, his voice tight. "I have not seen a weapon, Captain," Chloe conceded, knowing she couldn't make that leap without being challenged. "But his behavior is deeply unsettling. He's a large, physically imposing man, and he is creating an atmosphere of intimidation. My junior partner is unnerved, and frankly, I am not comfortable with his presence on this aircraft. I feel he poses a potential threat to the crew and passengers." The lie about Liam being unnerved was a crucial touch. It elevated her report from a personal feeling to a shared crew concern, giving it more weight. In the galley, Liam overheard this and froze, his blood running cold. She was putting his name on her false report, making him an unwilling accomplice. In the cockpit, Captain Miller was processing the information through the rigid filter of federal and company regulations. He had not seen the passenger. He had no visual or auditory information to contradict his lead flight attendant's report. The protocol was clear. The flight crew on the ground is the captain's eyes and ears. Their assessment of the cabin environment must be trusted. A lead flight attendant with a 12-year unblemished service record reporting a hostile passenger who was making crew uncomfortable was a red flag he was not allowed to ignore. The potential consequences of inaction, should something actually happen, were catastrophic. "Okay, Chloe, is the passenger contained right now?" Miller asked. "He is back in his seat, but he remains agitated," she lied again, glancing out at Marcus, who was calmly writing in his notebook. "All right, maintain a safe distance. Do not engage him further," Miller instructed. "We are on approach to Atlanta, about 35 minutes out. I'm going to notify operations on the ground. I want you to be prepared for law enforcement to meet the aircraft at the gate." "Understood, Captain," Chloe said, a surge of adrenaline and vindication washing over her. It had worked. She had been heard. She had been believed. The captain was taking her seriously. The full weight of the aviation security apparatus was now being mobilized because of her report. She hung up the interphone and turned to Liam, her face flushed with a sense of power. "The captain agrees. He's calling it in. They'll have police meet us at the gate." Liam stared at her, his mouth agape. "Police? Chloe, he's just sitting there writing in a notebook. Are you sure about this? We could get in a lot of trouble if we're wrong." Chloe's expression hardened. The brief moment of shared purpose was gone, replaced by her customary disdain for his weakness. "I'm not wrong," she snapped. "And I made the call, not you. Your job is to support your lead crew member. Do you understand me? You saw what I saw. He was being aggressive. End of story." It was a command and a threat, delivered in one breath. She was telling him what he had to say, what his version of the story would be. Liam, trapped and terrified, could only give a weak, jerky nod. He looked past her, through the gap in the curtain at the man in seat 2B, the man who had politely asked for water, the man who was about to walk off the plane and into a line of police officers because his flight attendant had decided he didn't belong in her cabin. A wave of nausea rolled through Liam's stomach. This was more than just wrong. It was a disaster in motion, and he had just agreed to help push it along. The descent into Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was smooth. The Georgia landscape, a patchwork of lush green forests and sprawling suburban neighborhoods, rose to meet the aircraft. Inside the cabin, the routine landing procedures began. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts, raising tray tables, and collecting any remaining service items. Chloe performed her duties with a newfound sense of gravity, her movements crisp and self-important. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a key player in a security operation. She avoided Marcus's row entirely, dispatching Liam to do the final check on that side of the aisle. As Liam passed seat 2B, he kept his eyes fixed on the overhead bins, unable to meet the passenger's gaze. He murmured, "Seatbelt fastened, sir?" without looking at him. "It is," Marcus replied, his voice calm as ever. He had noticed the change in the crew's behavior. He had noted the way Chloe had looked at him after her call to the cockpit, a look of grim satisfaction. He knew something had been set in motion. His senses, honed by years of walking into uncertain situations, told him that the flight was not going to end with a simple walk to the baggage claim. He wasn't afraid, he was simply preparing. He closed his notebook and placed it in his briefcase, his movements slow and deliberate. The aircraft touched down with a gentle bump, the roar of the reverse thrusters filling the cabin. As it slowed and began its long taxi toward the terminal, David Chanot, the lawyer in 2C, glanced out his window. What he saw made him sit up straight. Pacing the aircraft on the tarmac below were two vehicles from the Atlanta Port Authority Police Department, their lights flashing silently in the bright afternoon sun. They were following the plane as it made its way to the gate. Chanot's legal mind immediately connected the dots. The flight attendant's bizarre and hostile behavior toward the man in 2B, the hushed, angry conversations in the galley, and now a police escort on the ground. They weren't there by coincidence. She had called him in. Chanot felt a cold knot of anger and disbelief form in his stomach. He looked across the aisle at Marcus, who was looking straight ahead, his expression placid. The man seemed completely unfazed, either because he was unaware of the reception committee forming outside or because he was fully prepared for it. Chanot suspected it was the latter. The plane finally docked at the gate with a soft thud. The engines spooled down and the familiar chime sounded, signaling that it was safe to unbuckle. Passengers began to stand, reaching for their bags in the overhead bins. But the jet bridge did not immediately connect to the aircraft door. The forward cabin door remained closed. Then, Captain Miller's voice came over the intercom, not with the usual cheerful welcome, but with a tone of stern authority. Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety and security, please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. I repeat, all passengers are to remain seated until instructed otherwise. Cabin crew, prepare for gate arrival, but do not open the main door. A confused murmur rippled through the aircraft. Passengers who were standing sat back down, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and concern. This was not a standard procedure. In the first-class cabin, all eyes turned toward the front galley, where Chloe Jensen stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of grim determination. She was staring directly at seat 2B. The moments stretched into a minute, then two. The silence in the cabin was thick with tension. Then, through the cockpit door, a new sound, the click of the main aircraft door being opened from the outside, followed by the heavy tread of boots on the floor of the jet bridge. Chloe moved to the door, her hand on the latch, ready. She glanced back at Marcus, her eyes gleaming with a look that the passenger who had filmed the incident in the sample story would have described as pure satisfaction. This was her moment, the moment of validation, the moment the man who had dared to challenge her would be put in his place, publicly and decisively. She truly believed she was the hero of this story, the vigilant guardian who had neutralized a threat that no one else was perceptive enough to see. The humiliation of the passenger in 2B would be the proof of her competence, the vindication of her authority. She was about to be thanked for her service, for her bravery. The stage was set. The audience was captive. The only thing left was for the authorities to board the plane and arrest the man she had condemned. The main cabin door swung inward, and two uniformed officers from the Atlanta Port Authority Police stepped onto the aircraft. The first was a tall, powerfully built man in his late 40s with a salt-and-pepper mustache and sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. The second was a younger, leaner officer. They paused at the threshold, their eyes scanning the first-class cabin. The low chatter among the passengers died instantly, replaced by a tense, absolute silence. Every phone that had been put away was now surreptitiously raised, screens glowing as dozens of passengers began to record. Chloe Jensen stepped forward to meet them, her posture radiating self-importance. "Officers, thank you for the quick response," she said in a clear, authoritative voice meant for the entire cabin to hear. "I'm Chloe Jensen, the lead flight attendant. The individual is in seat 2B. She pointed a single, steady finger at Marcus. The sergeant's gaze followed her finger. He looked at Marcus, who was now sitting up straight, his hands resting on his thighs, clearly visible. The officer's expression was neutral, professional. He took a step into the aisle, his partner right behind him. The air was thick with expectation. This was the critical moment, the walk of shame, the public arrest. The sergeant moved down the aisle and stopped right next to seat 2B. He didn't look at Marcus with suspicion. Instead, his eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition dawning on his face. He glanced at the manifest in his hand, then back at the man in the seat. "Are you Marcus Thorne?" the sergeant asked, his voice unexpectedly respectful. Marcus met his gaze. "I am," he said calmly. The sergeant's stern, professional demeanor suddenly broke. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. He shook his head in disbelief and then extended his hand. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice now filled with warmth and surprise. "Sergeant Frank Miller, Port Authority."
But I was Corporal Miller.
2nd Battalion, 5th Marines in Fallujah. You probably don't remember me, but you and your team pulled my fire team out of a bad spot in the Jolan district back in 2004. We were pinned down, taking heavy fire. You guys came out of nowhere. The sound of the sergeant's words hit the cabin like a shockwave. The narrative Chloe had so carefully constructed of a dangerous, erratic passenger shattered in an instant. Marcus looked at the officer's outstretched hand, a faint memory stirring. He took it, his grip firm. "I remember the situation," Marcus said. "I don't always remember the faces. Good to see you made it home, Sergeant." "You too, Senior Chief," Miller replied, using Marcus's old rank with a deep, ingrained respect. "Hell, it's an honor to see you at all." He turned to his stunned partner. "This is Marcus Thorne. This man is a genuine American hero." The younger officer, who had been standing ready for a confrontation, blinked in surprise and then nodded respectfully. "Sir." The scene was so completely the opposite of what everyone, especially Chloe, had been braced for that the cabin remained frozen in a state of collective shock. A handshake instead of handcuffs, a tribute instead of a takedown, gratitude instead of an arrest. Sergeant Miller then turned his gaze toward Chloe Jensen. The warmth and respect vanished from his face, replaced by a look of cold, hard appraisal. He had received a dispatch about a hostile and erratic passenger. He had boarded the plane prepared for a dangerous confrontation. What he had found was a man he personally knew to be a decorated combat veteran, a hero, sitting calmly in his seat. The discrepancy was enormous, and his eyes pinned Chloe to the spot. "Ma'am," Sergeant Miller said, his voice dropping to a low, official tone that carried more menace than a shout ever could. "You reported this passenger as a threat. We're going to need you to explain that, in detail, right now." Chloe stood frozen in the aisle, her face a canvas of disbelief. The vindication she had been so sure was coming had curdled into a public nightmare. Her triumphant smile had dissolved, leaving her mouth hanging slightly open. The authority she had wielded with such arrogance for the entire flight evaporated under the police sergeant's icy stare. Every passenger in first class was staring at her, their expressions ranging from confusion to dawning comprehension, and in the case of David Chanel, pure, unadulterated contempt. Her moment of glory had become the moment of her unmasking. The silence in the cabin was no longer tense. It was judgmental. And it was all directed at her. The standoff in the aisle lasted for what felt like an eternity. Sergeant Miller's question, "We're going to need you to explain that," was not a request for information. It was an indictment. Chloe Jensen, who had been the absolute authority in this small world for the past 3 hours, was now speechless. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the scene she had envisioned with the reality playing out before her. Where was the struggle? The shouting, the justification for her actions? All she saw was a decorated war hero being greeted with reverence by the very police she had called to arrest him. He was acting suspiciously," she stammered, her voice a weak shadow of its former confidence. "He was being aggressive toward the crew." Sergeant Miller didn't even look at Marcus. His eyes remained locked on Chloe. "Aggressive how? Give me a specific, actionable example." Chloe's mind went blank. The vague, loaded terms that had worked so well with the captain were useless against the demand for concrete facts from a seasoned cop. What could she say? He asked for water with too much confidence? He stood up to get a notebook? He didn't look like he belonged here? Voiced aloud in this context, her justifications would sound as pathetic and prejudiced as they truly were. Before she could invent a response, another voice cut through the silence. It was David Chenault from Seat 2C. He had already unbuckled his seatbelt and was standing in the aisle, his newspaper with his handwritten notes clutched in his hand. "That's not true, Sergeant," Chenault said, his voice the calm, measured tone of a lawyer in a courtroom. "I've been sitting directly across from this gentleman for the entire flight. I have witnessed every interaction. At no point was he aggressive. At no point was he hostile." He took a step forward. "On the contrary, this flight attendant has subjected him to a campaign of deliberate harassment since we left New York. She refused him a glass of water. She skipped him during the coffee service. She neglected to give him a menu. Her behavior has been unprofessional and discriminatory. I have a record of it right here. He held up the newspaper. Chenault's statement was a bombshell. It provided independent, articulate corroboration of the truth, stripping Chloe of her last shred of credibility. The murmur in the cabin grew louder. People were now openly talking, comparing notes, shaking their heads. Sergeant Miller nodded slowly at Chenault, then turned his attention back to Marcus. Mr. Thorne, I apologize for this. Would you be willing to come down to our office at the terminal to provide a formal statement? Of course, Sergeant, Marcus said, standing and retrieving his briefcase from under the seat in front of him. He moved into the aisle with the same unhurried grace he had displayed all day. He paused and looked at David Chenault. Thank you, he said simply. Chenault nodded. It was the least I could do. Here, he handed Marcus his business card. David Chenault, if you need a witness or anything else, you call me. As Marcus and the officers prepared to deplane, Captain Miller emerged from the cockpit, his face pale and grim. He had heard the entire exchange over the still-open cabin door. He looked at the decorated soldier, then at his lead flight attendant, and the horrifying reality of the situation crashed down on him. He had grounded his plane and called in law enforcement based on a complete fabrication. His eyes met Chloe's, and the look he gave her was one of professional fury. Her career was over, and he knew it. Sergeant Miller turned to Chloe one last time. Ma'am, you will remain here. Airport security and airline management will want to speak with you. Do not go anywhere. He then addressed the stunned passengers. Folks, you are now free to deplane. We apologize for the delay. The spell was broken. Passengers began to get their bags, but they moved with a strange, quiet reverence, their eyes darting between Marcus, now being escorted off the plane like a VIP, and Chloe, who stood frozen and alone near the galley. As they filed past her, no one would meet her eye. She was an outcast, a pariah in her own kingdom. The deference and respect she craved had transformed into a wall of silent, contemptuous judgment. Her junior partner, Liam, was busy at the back of the cabin, pointedly avoiding the entire scene, his face ashen with shame and fear. The satisfying click of the handcuffs she had so eagerly anticipated had been replaced by the quiet, damning rustle of business cards being exchanged and the low, angry voice of her captain demanding answers. The humiliation was absolute, and it was entirely of her own making. The Port Authority office at Hartsfield-Jackson was a small, functional space tucked away from the public eye. It smelled of industrial-strength coffee and disinfectant. Marcus Thorne sat at a simple metal table across from Sergeant Miller, who had a digital recorder and a notepad in front of him. The other officer stood quietly by the door. The atmosphere was not one of interrogation, but of a formal debriefing among professionals. All right, Mr. Thorne, Miller began, his tone now fully official. For the record, could you please state your full name and date of birth? Marcus provided the information clearly and concisely. Thank you. Now I need you to walk me through everything that happened on Sovereign Air Flight 822 from the moment you boarded. Start at the beginning, and please, be as detailed as you can. Marcus nodded once. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. He began to speak, and his account was a model of precision and recall. It was not an emotional story of a man who had been wronged. It was a clinical, factual report delivered with the dispassionate clarity of a special operator after a mission. I boarded at LaGuardia at approximately 10:45 a.m. Eastern Time, he began. My seat was 2B, first class. The flight attendant in question was Ms. Chloe Jensen. The first significant interaction occurred approximately 1 hour into the flight. He recounted the request for water, quoting Chloe's responses verbatim. He described her tone and posture not with adjectives like angry or rude, but with objective descriptions. Her voice was declarative. Her posture was defensive, with her weight shifted to one hip. He detailed the subsequent series of slights with the same detached accuracy. At the commencement of the coffee service, approximately 40 minutes later, She served all passengers in the forward section of the first-class cabin except for me. She bypassed my seat without making eye contact. The junior flight attendant, Liam, later provided me with a hot towel, despite what I assessed to be non-verbal disapproval from Ms. Jensen. For the meal service, I was not provided with a menu until I verbally requested one, at which point Ms. Jensen recited the options instead of providing the printed card. Sergeant Miller took copious notes, his pen scratching across the paper. He didn't interrupt. He simply let Marcus speak. The event that I believe precipitated her call to the cockpit occurred approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes into the flight, Marcus continued. I stood to retrieve a notebook from my carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. The action took no more than 30 seconds. I stood, opened the bin, retrieved the item, performed a brief dorsal stretch, closed the bin, and returned to my seat. My back was to the galley for the majority of this action. Shortly thereafter, I observed Ms. Jensen engaged in what appeared to be a call on the cabin interphone. Her subsequent demeanor toward me was one of heightened vigilance. He concluded his account with the arrival at the gate and the police boarding. Throughout the entire narrative, he used no inflammatory language. He made no accusations of racism or prejudice. He simply laid out the facts, one after another, creating a sequence of events so clear and logical that her motivation became self-evident without him having to name it. The pattern of behavior spoke for itself. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Sergeant Miller clicked his pen and looked up from his notes. "And at no time did you raise your voice, use profane language, or make any physical gestures that could be interpreted as threatening?" "At no time," Marcus confirmed. "My objective was to de-escalate the situation at every turn." Miller nodded, a look of profound respect on his face. He had seen men break under the pressure of combat. He knew the kind of discipline it took to remain calm, not just under fire, but under the slow, grinding pressure of provocation. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. That is one of a hell of a clear, credible statement." He turned off the recorder. "Here's what happens now," he said, switching from policeman to trusted advisor. "We will file this as a formal incident report. The FAA will be notified. Sovereign Air Corporate Security is already on their way down to interview Jensen and the other crew. That lawyer, Mr. Chenault, has already called my desk and given a statement that corroborates yours in every single detail. Frankly, from a law enforcement perspective, there's nothing here. No crime was committed by you, but a serious one may have been committed by her. Filing a false report that initiates a security response on a commercial aircraft is a federal offense." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, but if I were you, I would be speaking to a very good civil attorney tomorrow morning. What you described isn't just bad customer service, it's a textbook case of targeted harassment. And with a witness like Chenault and your own credibility, they're going to have a very bad day." Marcus simply nodded. "I appreciate the advice, Sergeant." "Don't mention it," Miller said, standing up and extending his hand again. "It's the very least I can do. Thank you for your statement. And thank you again for what you did back in 2004. You are free to go." Marcus shook his hand, collected his briefcase, and walked out of the office. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threat. He had simply told the truth with precision and control. And he knew, with the certainty of a master strategist, that the truth would be more than enough. The first alert that reached the Sovereign Air corporate headquarters in Dallas was a sterile, jargon-filled notification from the Hartsfield-Jackson Operations Center. "Flight 822, gate arrival met by law enforcement. Code 7 security response initiated by crew. Situation resolved. Passenger cleared." To a junior analyst, it might have looked like a minor routine incident. But the passenger's name, Marcus Thorne, was flagged by an automated system linked to the airline's highest-value clients. Thorne was not just a first-class passenger. He was flying on a corporate account for a security firm that managed travel for thousands of top-tier executives. An incident involving him was, by definition, not routine. By the time Marcus was finishing his statement with Sergeant Miller, the alert had been escalated to the desk of Linda Carmichael, the Vice President of In-Flight Services. Carmichael was a sharp, no-nonsense executive who had seen every kind of crisis an airline could face, from weather disasters to mechanical failures. She made 2 calls immediately. The first was to the captain of Flight 822. The second was to the head of corporate security. Captain Miller's account was brief and furious. He relayed the report he had received from his lead flight attendant, Chloe Jensen, and the starkly contradictory reality he had discovered upon landing. He finished by saying, "Linda, this was a complete fabrication. She turned my aircraft into her own personal fantasy of a security threat. The passenger was a decorated military veteran, and she treated him like a criminal. We're lucky he was the man he was, or this could have gone sideways in a dozen different ways." The second call, from the head of security, was even more chilling. He had spoken to Sergeant Miller at the Port Authority. "Linda, the passenger's statement is rock solid and corroborated by another passenger, a corporate lawyer who took notes. The police are considering this a potential false report filing, which could mean federal charges against our employee. This is not going away." Panic in a corporate environment is a quiet, cold thing. It doesn't scream, it convenes emergency meetings. Within the hour, Carmichael was in a glass-walled conference room with the heads of legal, human resources, and public relations. The mood was grim. "Get me Chloe Jensen's file," Carmichael commanded. "I want to see everything, every commendation, every complaint, every performance review." An HR manager, a nervous-looking man named Robert, scurried off. He returned 10 minutes later with a thick manila folder and a tablet. "Her file is
Mostly clean.
Robert began, swiping through the digital record. "Good performance reviews, low sick day usage, commended for her professionalism in a 2019 review." "Mostly clean?" The head of legal, a woman named Anya Sharma, repeated, seizing on the qualifier. "What does mostly mean, Robert?" Robert swallowed hard. "There have been complaints, 7 of them over the past 5 years. A hush fell over the room. 7 complaints was a significant number for a single flight attendant. "What kind of complaints?" Carmichael asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Robert cleared his throat. They're of a similar nature. A black executive filed a complaint 3 years ago alleging she repeatedly asked to see his boarding pass, even after he was seated. A Hispanic businessman claimed she spoke to him in a condescending and demeaning tone. An Indian family traveling in business class reported that she suggested they might be more comfortable in Economy Plus. He kept scrolling, his voice getting smaller with each entry. Every single one of the 7 formal complaints had been filed by a passenger of color, and every single one had been dismissed. The resolutions were a litany of corporate inaction. Handled internally, counseled employee on customer service standards, marked as misunderstanding, no further action required. Not one had resulted in any formal disciplinary action. Not one had been investigated beyond a cursory conversation with Chloe herself, who had dismissed them all as the grumblings of overly sensitive passengers. Anya Sharma, the lawyer, swore under her breath. "So we have a documented history of racially charged complaints against this employee, all of which we dismissed. And she just initiated a full-scale security response against a black passenger who is also a military hero and a high-value corporate client. Is that the situation we're in?" No one had to answer. The catastrophic implications were clear. This wasn't just the story of one rogue employee. It was the story of a systemic failure, of an organization that had ignored a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior until it exploded into a crisis that now involved law enforcement, federal aviation regulations, and potentially millions of dollars in legal liability. "Pull her from the line immediately," Carmichael ordered, her face as hard as granite. "She's suspended, pending investigation, effective right now. Get a team down to Atlanta to interview her, the junior attendant, and every other crew member on that flight. I want a full report on my desk by morning." She looked around the table at the grim faces of her colleagues. "And someone get our crisis communications team in here. We need to get ahead of this. But I have a feeling there's no getting ahead of this. We're already 1,000 miles behind." The cascade had begun, and it was threatening to sweep the entire company over the edge. The internal investigation team from Sovereign Air descended on Atlanta with the grim efficiency of a disaster response crew. Their first priority was to secure every piece of available evidence from Flight 822, and in the modern age of aviation, that meant data. The truth of what happened in the first-class cabin was not going to be found in a he said, she said debate. It was etched into digital memory, waiting to be reviewed. The first and most damning piece of evidence came from the aircraft itself. The Airbus A321 was equipped with a state-of-the-art internal CCTV system, a network of tiny, high-definition cameras covering the galleys, doors, and cabin aisles. The footage was stored on a secure hard drive, which the investigators immediately retrieved. They sat in a windowless room at the airport, watching the entire flight unfold on a large monitor. The video was silent, but it spoke with unimpeachable clarity. There was the moment Marcus Thorne boarded, moving calmly to his seat. There was the call button light, illuminated for over 10 minutes before Chloe responded. They watched her lean over him, her body language visibly confrontational, while his remained open and non-threatening. They saw the coffee service, where her path through the cabin created a perfect, deliberate bubble around seat 2B. They saw her hand the menus to every passenger except for him. But the most critical sequence was the one that had triggered the security alert. They watched Marcus stand up. They saw him retrieve the notebook. The entire action was placid, normal. The investigators timed it, 28 seconds. They then watched him sit down and immediately begin writing. At no point did he scan the cabin. At no point were his movements aggressive or erratic. The footage was a direct, irrefutable contradiction of every claim Chloe Jensen had made in her report to the captain. The investigators then cross-referenced the time code on the video. Less than 1 minute after Marcus sat back down, the footage showed Chloe picking up the interphone. The visual evidence was absolute. She had initiated a federal security response based on a complete and total fabrication. The second piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. A passenger in seat 4A, a college student on her way home, had been filming out the window during the landing. When the police boarded, she had turned her phone to the aisle and recorded the entire interaction between Sergeant Miller, Marcus, and Chloe. The video was shaky, but the audio was crystal clear. It captured Sergeant Miller's words of respect, the handshake, Marcus's calm demeanor, David Chenault's intervention, and most importantly, Chloe's stunned, stammering attempts to justify herself. The video had already been sent by the student to her friends. The investigators knew it was only a matter of time before it found its way to social media and the press. The third pillar of evidence was the set of formal statements. They had Marcus Thorne's precise, clinical account. They had David Chenault's corroborated testimony, which he had already emailed to both the Port Authority and Sovereign Air's legal department. And now, they had the statement from the junior flight attendant, Liam. Liam had been interviewed for 2 hours. For the first hour, he had tried to stick to the story Chloe had commanded him to tell, muttering about how the passenger seemed off and how Chloe was just being cautious. But under the calm, persistent questioning of the corporate investigators, who already knew what the CCTV showed, his story crumbled. He finally broke down, admitting the truth in a torrent of relieved, terrified words. "She made it all up," he confessed, his voice cracking. "The passenger did nothing. He was polite the entire time. She was targeting him from the beginning. She told me to skip him during the service. She lied to the captain. She told me to lie, too. I was afraid of getting fired. I'm still on probation." His signed, written statement was the final nail in Chloe Jensen's coffin. The investigators now had a complete multi-angle view of the incident. They had video, audio, and sworn testimony from a witness, a victim, and a coerced accomplice. The picture that emerged was not one of a security threat that had been professionally handled. It was of a malicious act of harassment based on prejudice that had been recklessly escalated into a federal incident by a flight attendant with a history of similar behavior. The lead investigator compiled the evidence into a preliminary report and emailed it to Linda Carmichael in Dallas. The subject line was simple: Flight 822, Summary of Findings. Carmichael opened the attached files, the video clips, the audio recording, the signed statements. She read through them once, then a second time, a cold, sickening feeling growing in the pit of her stomach. The evidence wasn't just bad, it was perfect. It was an open and shut case, and their employee, their airline, was on the wrong side of all of it. Chloe Jensen spent 2 hours in a sterile, empty crew lounge waiting to be interviewed. During that time, she cycled through a series of self-justifying emotions. Her initial shock gave way to indignant anger. How dare they treat her like this? She was the one who had spotted the threat. She was the one who had followed protocol. The police sergeant was clearly an old friend of the passenger. It was a corrupt, unprofessional abuse of his authority. The other passenger who had spoken up was just an interfering busybody. She was the victim here. She had done her job, and she was being persecuted for it. She rehearsed her lines, polished her story, and prepared to be vindicated. She walked into the interview room with her head held high. Across the table sat 2 of Sovereign Air's senior corporate investigators, a man and a woman, their faces impassive. A laptop was positioned between them. "Ms. Jensen, thank you for your time," the male investigator, a former FBI agent named Harris, began. "We need to go over the events on Flight 822. Please, start from the beginning. Describe the behavior from the passenger in 2B that led you to believe he was a security threat." Chloe launched into her well-rehearsed performance. She described Marcus Thorne's challenging stare, his demanding tone when he asked for water, and his agitated scanning of the cabin. She painted herself as a seasoned professional, using her intuition and experience to detect a threat others might have missed. "I had a gut feeling that something was wrong," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "In my line of work, you learn to trust that instinct. It's about proactive safety." Harris let her speak for 10 uninterrupted minutes. He didn't challenge her, he just nodded, making occasional notes. When she finally finished her monologue, he paused for a moment. "That's a very serious set of observations," he said calmly. "Let's review the cabin footage to see if we can pinpoint the moments you're referring to." He turned the laptop around to face her and pressed play. The first clip was from the CCTV camera in the forward galley, showing the initial water request. The video was silent, but the body language was clear. It showed Marcus sitting calmly, speaking to her, and her standing over him, her posture rigid and confrontational. "Ms. Jensen," Harris said, pausing the video, "you described his tone as demanding. Can you show me the demanding behavior in this clip?" Chloe stared at the screen. The silent video told a different story from the one she had just told. "You can't hear him," she said defensively. "His tone was the problem." "We'll get to the audio later," Harris said smoothly. He clicked to the next clip, an angle from the main cabin aisle. "You mentioned he was scanning the cabin. This is a 2-minute clip from just before your call to the cockpit. Can you point out the scanning behavior?" The clip showed Marcus staring intently at his laptop, then looking up to read from his book. At no point did his head move to scan the cabin. He looked like any other focused business traveler. He was doing it before this," Chloe stammered, her confidence beginning to waver. Harris didn't respond. He just played the next clip, the one of Marcus getting his notebook from the overhead bin. He played it in real time, then again in slow motion. The movements were economical, controlled, and in no way aggressive. "This is the event you described to the captain as a sudden aggressive move," Harris stated, his voice flat. "Could you please explain what part of this action you found to be aggressive?" Chloe's face was beginning to flush. The objective, digital reality on the screen was systematically dismantling her narrative. "He's a very large man. His movements seemed forceful to me. I felt threatened." The female investigator, a woman named Cole, spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, but her question was sharp as a scalpel. "Did you feel threatened when the passenger in 3C, who is of a similar height, stood up to retrieve his bag?" She was referring to a white businessman who had done the exact same thing an hour earlier. "No, that was different," Chloe said quickly. How was it different? Cole pressed. It felt different, she insisted, unable to articulate a reason. Harris then slid a printed document across the table. It was a signed, sworn statement. Ms. Jensen, this is the statement from your junior partner, Liam Porter. In it, he states, and I quote, "The passenger did nothing threatening. Ms. Jensen fabricated the report to the captain. She instructed me to lie to support her story. Would you care to respond to that?" Chloe stared at the paper, her eyes wide with betrayal. The blood drained from her face. This was the blow she couldn't deflect. Her own partner, her witness, had turned against her. She was silent for a long time. The confident, authoritative flight attendant who had walked into the room was gone, replaced by a cornered woman with no more lies to tell. The investigators just sat there waiting, their silence more damning than any accusation. He didn't belong there," she finally whispered, the words barely audible. It was the core of it, the ugly, prejudiced truth that had fueled the entire incident. It wasn't about what he had done, it was about who he was and where he was sitting. Harris nodded slowly, as if she had finally confirmed the one thing they already knew. He closed the laptop. "Thank you, Ms. Jensen. I think we have everything we need." The interrogation was over, her career was over, and she had just handed them the confession. The report from the internal investigators landed on the desks of Sovereign Air's executive team like a judgment. It was a cold, factual document that outlined a catastrophic failure not just of a single employee, but of the systems designed to prevent such an abuse of power. The video evidence was irrefutable. The witness statements were damning. Chloe Jensen's own prejudiced admission was the final, ugly seal on the entire affair. The corporate response, when it came, was swift and brutal. There was no room for ambiguity, no possibility of a quiet resolution. The damage was too public, the evidence too clear. The first to fall was Chloe Jensen. She was summoned to a meeting at the airline's Atlanta crew base. It was not a negotiation or a discussion. She walked into a room with Linda Carmichael, who had flown in from Dallas, an HR executive, and a corporate attorney. The termination letter was already printed. She was fired for gross misconduct, including but not limited to filing a knowingly false security report against a passenger, endangering the safety of the aircraft by distracting the flight crew with a fabricated threat, targeted harassment of a passenger, and creating a hostile work environment. Her airline ID was deactivated on the spot. Her flight credentials were revoked. After 12 years of service, she was escorted from the building by security, her career in aviation reduced to the contents of a cardboard box. The junior flight attendant, Liam Porter, was next. While the investigators noted he had been coerced, his initial complicity and his failure to intervene were serious breaches of protocol. He was placed on immediate indefinite suspension pending a final review. Before that review could conclude, Liam submitted his resignation. His letter was a single, handwritten sentence. "I am resigning from a job I am no longer proud to do." He understood that his silence had made him a participant, and he could no longer live with that compromise. The reckoning then moved up the chain of command, from the incident itself to the negligence that had allowed it to happen. The internal audit of Chloe Jensen's complaint history became the focus. The HR manager, Robert, who had overseen the dismissal of the 7 prior complaints, was called into a meeting with the senior vice president of human resources. The evidence was laid out on the table, a clear, multi-year pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been repeatedly ignored. His defense, that he was following standard procedure and that the complaints were unsubstantiated, fell on deaf ears. He was fired for gross negligence in his duties and for failing to identify and act upon a clear pattern of employee misconduct that exposed the company to significant legal and reputational risk. The supervisor who had co-signed on several of those dismissals was also terminated. Even Captain Frank Miller faced a review. While he was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, the investigation confirmed he had followed federal protocol by acting on a credible-seeming report from his lead crew member. He was mandated to attend a series of intensive new training modules focused on crew resource management and threat assessment verification. The airline instituted a new policy requiring a two-person confirmation for any in-flight security threat that was not immediately and visually obvious, a direct result of the unchecked power Chloe had wielded. The fallout was a brutal, systematic purge. Sovereign Air was not just firing an employee, it was attempting to excise a cancer. The firings were a message sent throughout the entire company. The old way of dismissing inconvenient complaints, of protecting seniority at all costs, of turning a blind eye to the soft sins of prejudice, was over. The cost of that negligence had been made devastatingly clear by the events on Flight 822. The airline was now in full-blown crisis mode, trying to cauterize a wound that had been festering for years. But the firings were only the internal consequence. The external one, the one that would reshape the company's future, was still to come. 2 weeks after the incident, as the story, bolstered by the passenger's viral video of the police encounter, was exploding across national news networks, Sovereign Air was served with a lawsuit. It was filed in federal court by Marcus Thorne, represented by one of the most prominent civil rights law firms in the country. The lawsuit did not just name Chloe Jensen as a defendant, it named Sovereign Air and its parent corporation, alleging a corporate culture of negligence that enabled and protected discriminatory behavior. The complaint was a masterwork of legal argumentation. It laid out the events of Flight 822 with the same cool, devastating precision Marcus had used in his statement. But it went further. Attached as exhibits were the 7 prior complaints filed against Chloe Jensen, all by minority passengers. The lawsuit argued that the incident on Flight 822 was not an isolated event, but the predictable and inevitable outcome of the airline's deliberate indifference to a known problem. The legal team at Sovereign Air knew they were in an impossible position. The discovery phase of the lawsuit, where they would be forced to turn over internal documents and communications, would be a bloodbath. They had no viable defense. They had the video. They had the witness statements. They had the damning personnel file. And now, they had a plaintiff who was the perfect victim. A calm, articulate, decorated national hero. Going to trial would be an act of corporate suicide, a multi-week public relations disaster that would air all their dirty laundry and almost certainly result in a massive verdict against them. They immediately moved to settle. But Marcus Thorne's legal team made it clear that this would not be a simple negotiation over a sum of money. Marcus was not interested in a quiet payday and a non-disclosure agreement. He wanted change. The settlement demands were twofold. First, significant financial compensation, and second, a series of binding, court-enforced institutional reforms. The negotiations were tense. The airline fought hard against the mandated reforms, arguing they should be allowed to handle their internal policies themselves. But Thorne's lawyers held firm, threatening to walk away and proceed to a trial that would cost the airline 10 times more in brand damage than the settlement itself. In the end, Sovereign Air capitulated on every single point. The final settlement was for $7.2 million. The amount was broken down into compensatory damages for false imprisonment, defamation, and emotional distress, and a larger portion of punitive damages designed to punish the airline for its gross negligence. As part of the settlement, a significant portion of the punitive damages was assessed against Chloe Jensen personally, a move that would ensure her financial ruin. But the money for Marcus was the least important part of the victory. The real teeth of the settlement were in the institutional reforms, which were entered as a consent decree, making them legally binding and overseen by the court. Sovereign Air was forced to 1. Overhaul training. Completely redesign their flight attendant training curriculum to include mandatory intensive modules on racial bias, de-escalation, and the legal ramifications of filing false security reports. This training was to be designed by an outside civil rights organization. 2. Establish an independent review board. Create a new independent body to review all passenger complaints related to discrimination. This board would have the authority to override internal HR decisions and compel further investigation and disciplinary action. 3. Implement a three-strikes policy. Institute a formal policy where any employee who receives 3 substantiated discrimination complaints within a 5-year period is subject to automatic termination. 4. Enhance cabin monitoring. Commit to upgrading the CCTV systems on their entire fleet and implement a policy of retaining footage for a longer period, ensuring that future incidents would be thoroughly documented. The settlement was a landmark victory. It sent a shockwave through the entire airline industry. It established a new precedent for corporate accountability in cases of discrimination. It ensured that the ugliness Marcus Thorne experienced on Flight 822 would not just be a story that faded from the news cycle, but a catalyst for real structural change. He had been targeted because one woman thought he was powerless. He had responded by using his discipline and the rule of law to hold an entire corporation accountable and force it to become better. 6 months after the settlement, Marcus Thorne boarded Sovereign Air Flight 919 from Atlanta to San Francisco. He was flying to give a keynote address on leadership and resilience. He was, once again, in Seat 2B. As he settled in, a young flight attendant with a warm, genuine smile approached his seat. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Thorne," she said. "My name is Sarah. Can I get you a bottle of water or anything else while we finish boarding?" "Water would be great, Sarah, thank you," he replied. He watched as she went to the galley and returned immediately with a chilled bottle and a glass with ice and a lemon wedge. There was no hesitation, no challenge, just prompt, professional service. Throughout the flight, the crew was attentive, respectful, and courteous to every passenger. The culture felt different, calmer, more aware. The changes mandated by the lawsuit were not just words on paper, they were being put into practice. It was a single data point, but it was a hopeful one. Back in Dallas, at the Sovereign Air Training Academy, a new group of flight attendant recruits was sitting in a darkened classroom. The instructor, a stern but fair veteran, brought up the first slide of a brand new module titled Bias, Perception, and Responsibility. The slide was a single, stark image, a still frame from the CCTV footage of Flight 822. It showed a uniformed police officer shaking hands with a black passenger in the aisle of a first-class cabin. In the background, out of focus but clearly visible, was a flight attendant with blonde hair, her face a mask of horrified shock. Beneath the image was a single line of text in bold, white letters. This encounter was the result of a false security report. It led to multiple terminations, a federal investigation, and a $7.2 million settlement. It was 100% preventable. The instructor let the image hang in the silence for a long moment. "We don't show you this to shame anyone," she began, her voice steady. "We show you this because it is the most important lesson you will learn here. Your perception is not always reality. Your authority in the cabin is not absolute. It is a responsibility. And a mistaken judgment at 35,000 feet, fueled by personal bias, can ruin lives, end careers, and cost this company more than just money. It can cost us the one thing we can never buy back, our passengers' trust. Let's break down what happened here so that it never, ever happens again." The names were not used. They didn't need to be. The story had become a legend within the airline, a cautionary tale of the highest order. The image on the screen was not just a picture of Marcus Thorne and Chloe Jensen. It was a picture of a turning point, a moment when the cost of prejudice was calculated in stark, unavoidable terms. For his part, Marcus Thorne never spoke publicly about the incident again. He declined every interview request, turned down every offer to appear on talk shows. He had no interest in becoming a professional victim or a talking head on the news. His victory was in the court documents, in the enforced changes, and in the quiet knowledge that he had fought his battle and won. With the settlement funds, he did something that no one outside of his inner circle ever knew about. He quietly established the Sentinel Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing free legal resources and advocacy for veterans and active duty service members who have been victims of racial discrimination. The foundation was run by a small, dedicated team and was funded almost entirely by an anonymous benefactor. He never put his name on it. The work was the reward. It was a legacy of service, transformed from the battlefield to the courtroom, fighting a different kind of war for the soul of the country he had served for so long. He had taken one of the ugliest moments of his life and used it to build a shield for others. It was the quiet, effective, and honorable thing to do. It was the only way he knew. What happened on Flight 822 was never truly about a glass of water. It was about a fragile ego clinging to a sliver of power. For the flight attendant, Chloe Jensen, her first-class cabin was her kingdom, and her authority within it was the primary source of her self-worth. When she saw Marcus Thorne, a black man who carried himself not with the deference she expected, but with a quiet, unshakable confidence that needed no validation from her, it presented a fundamental challenge to her worldview. His very presence in her space, in a seat of privilege, felt like a violation of an unspoken, prejudiced order. Her aggression wasn't a reaction to a threat. It was a desperate attempt to reassert a dominance that she felt was slipping away. She needed to put him back in what she perceived to be his place, and she was willing to use the full power of her uniform and the security apparatus behind it to do so. Looking back, one can't help but wonder what might have changed the outcome. If Marcus Thorne had been a different man, one without the profound discipline forged in the crucibles of special operations, would he have reacted with anger? If he had raised his voice just once, her narrative of the aggressive passenger might have found a foothold, and the story could have ended very differently. If David Chenault hadn't been a lawyer trained to observe and document, would it have simply become a he said, she said situation? The incident serves as a chilling reminder that in the face of baseless accusation, one's best, and sometimes only, defense is a level of composure that feels almost superhuman, and the good fortune of having a credible witness. Ultimately, this story is a powerful illustration that true strength isn't about the authority a uniform gives you, but about the dignity you maintain when that authority is turned against you. Marcus Thorne's victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in every moment he refused to let her poison dictate his response. He won long before the police ever boarded the plane because he stayed true to his own code of conduct, a code of honor and discipline that she could never comprehend, let alone defeat. What do you think? If you had been a passenger on that flight, would you have spoken up like David Chenault did? And what do you believe is the most effective way to confront prejudice when you see it happening in public? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and please consider subscribing for more stories of justice and accountability.